Lucas Martins had lived more than enough for an entire lifetime. The police station in his hometown had always been a place of mysteries, secrets, and unspoken rules. He had survived years of psychological tension, sinister cases, and a series of events that couldn't be logically explained. Throughout his career, many colleagues had left, never to return. Some left in fear, others with their minds broken. But he, Lucas, had endured. And now, after years of living on the edge, he decided it was time to start over. He packed his bags, grabbed his things, and moved to a small town, far from the chaos and horrors of the past. The new police station felt like a relief. The white walls, the smell of fresh paint, and the friendly faces of his new colleagues were a direct contrast to the darkness he had left behind. No one there knew about his past, and he planned to keep it that way. He wanted a fresh start. And for the first time in a long while, he believed it was possible. When he entered the chief's office, he was taken aback by a gesture of hospitality. The chief, an older man with a deep gaze, extended his hand and said with a light smile, "Welcome, Lucas. We're happy to have you on the team. Before you get started, we need to go over a few guidelines. These rules are essential to ensure your safety and the smooth operation of our work here. Nothing major, just protocol." The chief then handed him a sheet of paper where the rules were written in a dry, impersonal tone. Lucas read them carefully, feeling a strange sensation grow inside him as his eyes scanned the words. They were simple, almost trivial, but something about them felt off. 1. Never ignore the signs. If something feels wrong, trust your intuition. 2. Do not ask about unsolved cases. 3. All files must be kept secure. Never leave a file incomplete. 4. If you hear something unusual, check it out immediately. Do not ignore it. 5. Never, under any circumstances, enter room 3B. The last rule caught his attention. A room with a simple label reading 3B that was never to be accessed. He found it curious, but that was all. After finishing the reading, the chief stared at him intently, as if waiting for a reaction. "These rules are for your safety. We follow a strict policy, but you'll get used to it. Now, you'd better get started. The patrol service begins soon." Lucas didn't say anything. He tucked the sheet into his pocket, thanked the chief, and headed to his new workstation. Something inside him was on alert, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly why. After all, he knew every police station had its quirks, and he'd faced much stranger things in the past. Maybe it was just the stress of starting over. However, as time went on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time he walked through the station's hallways, he felt a constant gaze upon him, as if he were being watched from every angle. It was a vague sensation, but unmistakable. He had never been able to ignore his instincts, and this place was proving to be a fertile ground for any kind of psychological discomfort. During his first night shift, while going through files and preparing documents for the next morning, something strange happened. He noticed that one of the files he had left on his desk was missing. He was sure he had put it there. It wasn't the first disappearance, and he knew that. He had heard rumors among the colleagues about documents that simply vanished without explanation, but no one seemed to care much. It was as if everyone had gotten used to it, as if the abnormal was normal. He decided it wasn't something to worry about for now. After all, he was there to work, not to investigate bizarre stories. Still, the missing file bothered him. It couldn't just be a memory lapse. It couldn't. The next morning, while talking to one of the older officers, Lucas casually asked about the missing files. But the man only looked at him blankly, as if he didn't understand the question. With a crooked smile, he replied, "Don't worry about it, Lucas. The rules say we shouldn't question. Just follow them. That's all we need to do to ensure our safety here." Lucas felt uneasy. What had he just heard? A warning disguised as an answer, yet laced with a subtle undertone of threat? He knew something was going on, but what could it be? He had been a cop long enough to understand that there was something bigger at play here. But at the same time, he knew that if he started asking too many questions, he'd be putting himself in danger. So, he decided to follow the rules, as he had always done in his life, and not let fear take control. After all, he was there to start over, to finally find some peace. However, Lucas didn't know that those rules, which seemed simple and harmless, were about to lead him into a nightmare from which he would never escape. The following days were calm. Lucas quickly adapted to the routine of the new station. His co-workers were competent, but something still bothered him. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was a heavy atmosphere that seemed to linger in the air. When the hallway lights flickered, or when the wind howled through the broken window, he felt a chill run down his spine. But he remained steady, reminding himself of the rules he had to follow. Everything seemed relatively normal until the night he was assigned to the watch shift. He was alone, sitting behind his desk, when the silence of the station was broken by a muffled sound. The noise was coming from the far end of the hall, from the side where room 3B's door was located. Lucas hesitated, glancing at the clock. It was late, well past midnight, and the sound seemed unnatural. Like something was dragging, or worse, someone was trying to enter or exit that forbidden room. He knew what the rules said. Never enter room 3B. But something inside him, that police instinct that had never left him, pushed him toward the door. He stood up, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The distance to the room felt farther than usual, as if the station itself was making an effort to stretch the time until he reached his destination. The closer he got, the louder the sound became. Now it was clear. Someone was inside. The heavy breathing, the dragging steps, everything was so vivid. But how is this possible? No one was supposed to be in room 3B. Lucas glanced to the side, where the small bulletin board was mounted on the wall. Those rules were etched in his mind, but the last one, the one that troubled him the most, seemed to have an inexplicable pull on him. He approached the door and placed his hand on the doorknob. Then, everything went quiet. The sound stopped abruptly. Nothing. Not even a sigh. He felt the air grow heavier, his heartbeat quickening. For a moment, everything was still, as if the station itself was waiting for him to make a decision. It was as if the room was waiting. Lucas took a deep breath, cold sweat dripping down his forehead. He wanted to leave, go back to his desk, and ignore what was happening. But what if someone was really in there? What if, somehow, he was the only one who could stop something? Curiosity, that police instinct stronger than any warning, began to overpower his actions. With a swift movement, he turned the doorknob and stepped inside. The room was dark, with the lights flickering intermittently, casting shadows of indistinct shapes all around. A sense of oppression filled him, as if the air was heavier, harder to breathe. He looked around, but there was no one in sight. Just a cluttered desk, papers scattered everywhere, and a blank board on the wall. Lucas moved forward cautiously. There was no evidence that anyone had been there recently, but something wasn't right. He could feel the presence of something or someone, even though his eyes couldn't make it out. The silence in the room seemed to swallow all sounds, as if the space had been isolated from the rest of the station. He walked further in, until something caught his attention. A folder labeled Case 3B was on the desk, open. Lucas approached and began examining the papers. They were incomplete records, investigation reports that had never been finished. None of the cases seemed to have been solved. All of them were marked with an old date and a vague description: incident unknown. Status: disappearance. There were no further details. And what disturbed him the most was the fact that, on some pages, his name appeared. Lucas Martins, police officer. Confidential report. A chill ran down his spine. How was this possible? He hadn't been involved in any case here. Not yet. Before he could think further, a strange sensation crawled up the back of his neck. Something was behind him. He spun around quickly, but there was nothing. Just the emptiness of room 3B. He swallowed hard, and with a trembling hand, he closed the folder and placed it back where it had been. That's when the door slammed shut on its own. Lucas tried to open it, but the doorknob was jammed. He was trapped. Fear began to take over him. He looked around desperately, trying to find a way out. And then, in a dark corner of the room, he saw it. It wasn't a person, but a shape. Something hooded, with an indistinct silhouette, moving slowly through the shadows as if it were drawing closer to him. The air was heavy, thick, and the sense of dread grew with each step the figure took. Lucas tried to scream, but his voice seemed muffled, as if something was sucking the sound out of the room. He pounded on the door with all his strength, but nothing happened. The silence was deafening, save for the slow footsteps that approached. The figure stopped. Lucas couldn't see its face, but he could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on his chest. He knew something was terribly wrong, but he couldn't move, couldn't react anymore. The rules of the station had been clear. He shouldn't have entered room 3B. But now he was here, and there was no turning back. And then the figure spoke, its voice low, but distinct. "You asked the questions, Lucas. Now you're part of the case." Those words echoed in his mind as he felt the weight of those rules finally closing in on him. Lucas could no longer tell what was real and what wasn't. The figure in front of him seemed to stretch, its presence expanding through the room. The air grew thick, almost suffocating. He tried to move, but his body felt frozen, as if fear had taken root deep inside, paralyzing him. "You asked the questions, Lucas. Now you're part of the case." The voice seemed to come from all directions at once, reverberating off the walls. He wanted to scream, but the sound never came. The pressure on his chest was unbearable. His eyes began to adjust to the darkness, and he started noticing details that were hidden before. The walls were covered in marks, scratches, as if something had tried to break free. Something old, something desperate. The figure, still hooded and unclear, took a step toward him. The sound of its footsteps on the floor was muffled, but its presence became sharper, more defined, as if its essence was absorbing everything around it, erasing any trace of normality. "You're familiar with the rule, Lucas?" The voice again, lower this time, but impossible to ignore. He felt a growing sense of suffocation, like the room itself was trying to swallow him whole. "No one leaves room 3B without becoming part of it." The officer forced himself to take a step back, finally managing to regain some movement. But as soon as he moved, the figure closed in even faster. It was as if the space itself was shrinking. He couldn't tell if the panic he felt was from the proximity of the presence or the sense that something was approaching him, inevitable. There was no more time to hesitate. "You know what happened to the others, don't you, Lucas?" The voice now seemed to come from inside his head, blending with his own thoughts. The pain of trying to escape felt almost physical. His breath was coming in shallow gasps, his hands ice cold. He looked at the door, trying to open it again. No way out. The doorknob wouldn't budge, as if the room had completely sealed off his entrance. The feeling of being trapped was inescapable. Who are you guys?" Lucas managed to ask, his voice trembling. The figure made a vague gesture, as if shrugging, and its presence seemed to spread even further through the room, engulfing everything. Suddenly, time seemed to slow down. The objects in the room began to warp, as if being pulled toward an invisible vortex. It was as if the walls were curling inward, and Lucas could no longer tell where the space began or ended. He was being consumed by something he couldn't comprehend. "You can't understand, officer. Case 3B is what it becomes, not what it was." The figure's voice mixed with a deep sound that seemed to come from beneath the earth. The words twisted, becoming a series of unintelligible sighs. Lucas began to retreat, but as he took a step back, his foot got caught on something. He looked down, and his heart skipped a beat. There was a line, a thin but unmistakable line drawn on the floor. As he followed it, he realized it led him to the wall, where a nearly invisible door was hidden by the darkness. The figure slowly began to fade, its body seeming to disintegrate into the shadows. But before it disappeared completely, it said, with a chilling coldness, "When you cross the line, Lucas, the rule was broken. Now you have to decide. If you want to leave, you'll need to do what the others did." Lucas looked at the door. The sense of dread overtook him. But what was worse? Staying trapped in that room, allowing himself to be consumed by that presence, or crossing the line and trying to understand what lay beyond. The rule was clear: don't go in. And he knew that better than anyone. He took a deep breath and made the only choice left. With a swift movement, he stepped toward the line and crossed it. The room exploded in a blinding light, and Lucas felt like he was being pulled into a whirlwind. The disorientation was brutal. He was thrown forward, and before he could grasp what was happening, the room vanished. When he opened his eyes, he was back at the station, at the same desk where it had all started. The light in the room was brighter, clearer. Nothing seemed to have changed, but he felt a sense of déjà vu, like he had returned to a starting point, where the rules hadn't been broken yet, but everything was about to happen all over again. What he didn't know was that by crossing the line, he had taken on a new role in that dark game, and nothing would ever be the same. The light in the station seemed colder now. Lucas looked around, trying to regain his composure, but there was something off about the atmosphere. The sense of déjà vu lingered. He got up, walked over to the window, and looked outside. The city seemed the same, but there was a weight in the air, like he was trapped in a loop, as if time had stopped, and he was the only one aware of it. However, when he turned to go back to his desk, he noticed something that shouldn't have been there. The list. The list of rules. It was there on the desk, as if it had always been there, as if it was an inseparable part of the environment. He didn't remember leaving it there, but he couldn't doubt it. It was waiting for him. With trembling fingers, he picked up the paper and read once more the instructions that had marked his first experience at the station earlier. 1. Never trust your instinct. 2. Never ignore a call that doesn't come from the main line. 3. If the light goes out, don't reopen the door. 4. Don't enter the bathroom on the 3rd floor after midnight. 5. Any case related to the number 3B should be avoided at all costs. 6. Never speak of what happens on silent nights. 7. When night falls, the office will no longer be yours. Lucas tried to take a deep breath. The list was stronger now, more threatening, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. But something was off. The numbering. Rule 3B seemed to have become a part of his past in a more intense, personal way. He could feel room 3B again, could see the door closing behind him as he crossed the line. Now, he knew what it meant. He was no longer free. He never had been. The station was silent, but that silence felt heavier, like muffled breathing coming from somewhere far away. He looked around at his colleagues, but they were all busy, not paying attention to him. That should be good, right? Normalcy was there, but the weight of the experience he had lived through seemed to make him a stranger in his own job. When the central phone rang, Lucas didn't hesitate. It was the rule. He couldn't ignore calls, but something in his chest tightened. He picked up the receiver, feeling the cold vibration of the line in his hand. Central Station, how can I help you? Lucas asked, trying to hide the nervousness in his voice. On the other end, a hoarse, distorted voice replied, Lucas, you haven't learned, have you? Lucas's blood ran cold. The voice sounded familiar, but he couldn't place where from. And then he heard something he shouldn't have. The sound of laughter. Low, muffled, but unmistakably laughter from multiple people. A chill ran down his spine. Who is this? Lucas tried to keep calm, but his voice sounded strange, like he was starting to lose himself. You're back, Lucas. You followed the rules. But did the rules follow you? The line went silent for a second, and then the voice came back, closer and more distorted. You knew what was at stake, but now you can't leave. The 3B case has already begun. The phone abruptly disconnected, and Lucas just stared at the device, the sound of his own heartbeat echoing in his head. He glanced around at the other officers, but no one seemed to have noticed what just happened. It was as if reality was warping around him. He tried to convince himself it was just stress, the tension of the job, but something inside him knew it was far beyond that. With no more time to think, he stood up abruptly, determined to leave the station and get some fresh air. But as he tried to open the door, something halted his movement. The doorknob was hot, as if it had been heated by some invisible presence. The feeling of suffocation grew stronger. He was trapped there, unable to escape. That's when he noticed something even more disturbing. On one of the walls, an inscription began to appear slowly, as if it had been drawn by an invisible finger, or perhaps by a malevolent force beyond understanding. The inscription read simply, "The case never ends." Lucas's blood froze again. He knew what that meant. The 3B case was not just a reference. It wasn't just a number. He was inside it. And now he had to follow the rules he could no longer escape. Every decision, every movement was sealing his fate. As fear took over him, the station's door shut by itself. No sound, no warning. The only sign that something had changed was the sound of the lock turning, marking that something had shifted. Something beyond Lucas's control. And in that moment, he knew with clarity. The 3B case had become his prison. And he was no longer in control of anything. The darkness in the station seemed to intensify. The clock on the wall ticked the hours away, but Lucas couldn't remember how much time had passed since the door closed. The light from the lamp flickered, but not in a normal way. Every flicker of light seemed like a glimpse of something distant, something watching him, something feeding off the fear. He stood there in the same spot, his breathing shallow, trying to understand what was happening. The heat of the doorknob still burned in his hands, a reminder of the invisible touch that had trapped him there. The sound of his heartbeat echoed in his head, deafening. He forced himself to breathe deeply, trying to find some logic in the chaos surrounding him. But there was no logic. Not anymore. With an effort, he looked over at the other officers. They were still at their posts, completely oblivious to everything. But he knew, deep down, with every fiber of his being, that something wasn't right. None of this was normal. The silence in the station was suffocating. There was no sound at all, except for his own breathing. He felt a chill when he realized there was no more noise coming from the main phone line, no traffic sounds outside, no chatter in the halls. He was completely cut off. Not sure what to do, Lucas started to walk through the station, passing by the records room, the workstations. Everything seemed fine, like nothing had changed. But then, as he walked past the door to a room at the end of the hallway, something stopped him. The door was slightly ajar, a thin line of light spilling out from between the cracks. He approached cautiously, the weight of his footsteps echoing through the quiet. The room was completely empty, except for an old table in the center, covered with papers and files. But something caught his eye. On the table, resting on a pile of documents, was an envelope. Without thinking, Lucas moved closer and grabbed it, feeling the cold surface against the tips of his fingers. The paper was thick and yellowed, the edges slightly worn. With a deep sigh, he tore open the envelope and pulled out its contents. Inside was a single sheet of paper, crumpled and seemingly old. He carefully unfolded it, trying to make sense of what was written. It was a letter. "Lucas," the letter began, in shaky yet clear handwriting, "you've been following the rules, but the rules won't save you. Case 3B has already begun, and nothing you do can stop what's coming. You know what this means." Lucas felt the blood freeze in his veins. He was about to drop the letter when the last line caught his attention. "You are trapped in the maze. Now, the only way out is to the center." Whatever that meant, he didn't know, but he felt like he was being watched, as if something or someone was waiting, observing every move he made. The room began to spin slightly, as though it was being pulled by an invisible force, something dragging him into a different reality. The air grew heavier. He dropped the letter, almost involuntarily, and it landed with a muffled thud on the floor. His eyes locked on a shadow moving in the corner of the room, a shadow that seemed to grow, stretching toward him. He recoiled, his throat tightening. The shadow had no shape, no face, but he knew what he was seeing. It was a manifestation of the darkness itself, a presence that had been following him since the moment he walked into the station. It was 3B. It was the thing that had been chasing him. And now he could no longer escape. The ground beneath his feet began to slowly dissolve, as if being swallowed by the darkness. He tried to run, but his feet felt heavy, almost glued to the floor. The feeling of claustrophobia grew, as if invisible hands were tightening around him. Every breath was harder than the last, and the air seemed to thicken, as if it were being sucked out of his lungs. He screamed for help, but no sound came from his mouth. And then he heard the voice, once again. "There is no escape, Lucas. The maze is your new home." The light flickered one more time, and when it went out, Lucas found himself back in the dark hallway, exactly where it all began. He was in a place with no end, no way out. The corridor stretched before him, with closed doors, but he knew he couldn't open any of them. Not now. He was trapped, and the rules he had followed, the rules he had believed would save him, were now his chains. And the true story of Case 3B had only just begun. Lucas stood still in the hallway, the sound of his own heart pounding in his ears, while the darkness around him seemed to grow. He tried to understand what was happening, but the rules he had followed so carefully no longer made sense. How could something so simple be so cruel? How could something so specific and exact have turned into an absolute nightmare? He looked around, searching for an escape, something familiar. But the hallway in front of him seemed to stretch on infinitely, as if time and space had lost all meaning. Every door was closed. Every window was locked. He was in a maze, a place where there was no right direction, where the walls weren't just physical, but psychological as well. The pressure on his chest increased. It was as if the air was being squeezed out of his lungs with every passing second. Lucas began to walk, his steps muffled by the oppressive silence. He felt like he was in a dream, but not a good one. It was a nightmare he couldn't control. He no longer knew where he was, in the real world or trapped in a mental prison created by an unknown force. As he walked, he couldn't help but notice something strange. The doors in the hallway were beginning to change. Not physically, but on some deep, invisible level. The nameplates were shifting, writing new words, names he had never seen before. He stopped in front of a door he hadn't noticed before. It seemed ordinary at first glance, a simple wooden door, but as he approached, a chill ran down his spine. He grasped the doorknob and stepped inside. Inside, there was a familiar room, but at the same time, it was strangely distorted. It was the interrogation room from the station, but the table was covered with a layer of dust, and the lights flickered frantically. The walls were marked with dark stains, as if something had crawled through there, leaving trails behind. And on the table, something caught his attention. It was a file, and beside the file, a photo of Lucas himself, but different. The look in the photo was empty, devoid of any emotion. He shuddered as he grabbed the file. Inside, there was only a single sheet of paper with one name written on it. Lucas Silva, Case 3B. Case 3B. The words echoed in his mind, as if trying to permanently carve themselves into his memory. He felt a wave of despair take over him, but there was no escape. He knew he was already caught in something far beyond any rule, any procedure, or any detective could comprehend. The photo stared back at him, as though mocking his attempt to escape. He could no longer think clearly, as if he were being consumed by the very pain of his existence in this maze. He thought about the rules that had once been his anchors for survival, the ones he had followed so diligently, believing they could protect him. Now he understood. The rules weren't meant to save. They were meant to imprison. The air grew heavier, the light flickered out again, and suddenly, he heard the sound he never wanted to hear. A crack, like a door slowly being opened. The sound reverberated through the room. He turned, heart pounding, and saw a shadow forming in front of him, a silhouette materializing in the darkness. It was the shadow he already knew, the one that had been watching him in the depths of his nightmare. He tried to scream, but he couldn't. The words wouldn't come out. There was no space left for screams, only fear, anguish, and the echo of his own breath. The shadow moved closer, its shape taking on a grotesque consistency, as if it were feeding on the darkness itself. He realized there was no choice left. He could no longer follow the rules. He could no longer try to understand what was happening. That being, that presence, it had been part of the game from the very beginning. It was the end of the game. Lucas. The voice came from behind him, whispering, soft, but clear. He didn't dare look back. You knew from the start that there was no way out. Now you'll live with it. You'll live with the truth you created. The room began to collapse around him, the walls dissolving, the floor cracking. The maze was closing in. He no longer knew what was real and what wasn't. But when the last wall vanished, he found himself back in the precinct. But nothing was familiar anymore. There was no human presence left. Just an old chair, spinning by itself, slowly, in a dark corner. And in the mirror on the wall, he saw the answer. The reflection wasn't his. It was the reflection of the officer who never existed. He smiled, and Lucas finally understood. Case 3B wasn't just a case. It was him. He always was the case. He was the key. And the maze had no end. Lucas stepped away from the mirror, his eyes fixed on the distorted image that reflected back at him. What was real? What had he become? He tried to breathe, but the feeling of suffocation enveloped him, as if the air was denser, heavier than it should have been. The shadows in the room seemed to be closing in slowly, moving in directions that made no sense, as if the very space was twisting around him. The chair continued to spin, but now its rotation felt more frantic, as though it were pulling reality itself into its center. The creaking of the wood blended with a low, muffled laugh that Lucas couldn't quite place, but it sent a cold shiver down his spine. He turned around, desperately trying to understand what was happening, but there was no one else in the room. It was just him, and the emptiness that surrounded him. When he looked to the side, he saw a piece of paper on the table, a simple sheet, but with text written in black ink, almost immortalized by age. He approached slowly, as if the paper were a forbidden object. The words seemed to glow as he leaned closer, as if they were being written in real time as his eyes passed over them. The last rule cannot be broken. The last rule is beyond your understanding. You cannot escape, you cannot hide. You have already made your choice. Lucas swallowed hard. What did this mean? He already knew he had been caught, that the trap was set to close around him. But there was something about that final line that made him feel an even deeper fear, a sense of inevitability. As if he had played a game he could never win. He tried to pull away, but something tugged him back. It was as if the very air was holding him, pressing him against the table. His muscles involuntarily contracted, as though he were a puppet caught by the invisible strings of something far greater. Reality warped around him, like he was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. The shadows in the room began to stretch, reaching out toward him, their movements slow but deliberate. They seemed to pulse with life, growing larger, more defined, as if they were alive, waiting for him to make a move. He felt the walls closing in on him, but it wasn't the walls themselves. It was the presence of something watching, something that knew him, knew everything about him. And it was closing in on him, piece by piece, until there would be nothing left. The laughter grew louder, echoing off the walls, twisting into something darker, more sinister. It wasn't just a sound now. It was a presence, a force that filled the room with dread. There's no way out, Lucas. The voice came again, clearer now, as if it were right behind him. You've always known this. The game was never about winning. It was about choosing. His vision blurred, and the room seemed to distort further, folding in on itself like a collapsing tunnel. The air became thick, suffocating, as if reality itself were being squeezed out of existence. His mind screamed for clarity, for any sign of escape, but there was nothing. Only the suffocating embrace of the maze, the game that had no end. And then, just as quickly as it all began, everything stopped. The laughter faded. The shadows receded. The room was silent, empty. Lucas blinked, disoriented. For a moment, he wondered if he had imagined it all. But as he looked around, he saw the truth in the details. The chair had stopped spinning, but now it faced him directly, as if waiting for him to sit. He knew what had to come next. There was no way out. Only one path remained, and he had already chosen. And then he saw it, or rather, heard it. The voice that had been following him from the very beginning. The voice he'd been trying to ignore, but now it was impossible not to hear. You never understood the rules, Lucas. You never understood the game. The words were whispered deep in his mind, as if they were being spoken in a language he didn't understand, but at the same time, he knew they'd always been there. They came from all directions, making the room feel like it was shrinking, the walls closing in, the space becoming more and more claustrophobic. He closed his eyes, trying to fight off the panic, trying to make sense of the chaos surrounding him. But there was no sense, no explanation, only the feeling of being completely lost, out of control, like a piece of a puzzle whose picture he would never be able to piece together. You were chosen for this, Lucas. It wasn't a coincidence. You should never have left the First City. The game follows wherever you go. And the rules will always be with you. When he opened his eyes again, he saw the mirror once more. But this time, the reflection staring back at him wasn't just the cop he knew. It wasn't just the face marked by pain and loss. No. It was something more. Something he didn't want to see. It was him. But it wasn't. The figure in the mirror smiled, a hollow smile, as if mocking his entire existence. The smile had no humanity. It had no soul. It was as if Lucas had lost himself, as if he were now a creation of something far darker and older than he could ever imagine. And that's when he understood. He was no longer in control. He had never been. The final rule wasn't something he could follow or escape. It was a sentence. It was the end of the game. The room collapsed around him, the walls disintegrating as if they'd never existed. The air grew oppressive, impenetrable, and Lucas felt an increasing pressure in his chest. But he didn't scream. There were no more screams to be had. He was beyond that, beyond fear. The reflection in the mirror smiled again. And now, Lucas, you will be the last rule. And with that, darkness swallowed him, and he disappeared,